Today, waking up in the middle of the night feels like a problem. For much of history, it wasn't. People once slept in two separate stretches because night itself used to work differently. And once you understand what darkness, silence, and ordinary life used to feel like after sunset, that strange old habit starts to make a lot more sense. Most of us think of good sleep as one clean block. You go to bed, disappear for 7 or 8 hours, and if you wake up at 2 in the morning, something must have gone wrong. But that expectation belongs to a very modern world. A world with electric light. A world with fixed schedules. A world where the night has been pushed back, brightened, and compressed. For most people in the past, night felt completely different. It was darker than most of us can easily imagine. Not dim, dark. Once the sun went down, the day did not continue the way it does now. Candlelight was weak. Oil lamps were limited. Firelight only reached so far. If you wanted light, you had to pay for it, tend it, and stay close to it. And because evenings were darker and less active, many people went to bed earlier than we do now, especially in winter. That matters, because when you go to sleep much earlier, the night changes shape. It becomes longer, looser, less like one sealed stretch, and more like something you move through in stages. That seems to be part of what was happening. In older sources, people sometimes referred to a first sleep and a second sleep. That detail is easy to miss, but it tells us something important. They often mentioned those two sleeps casually, as if no explanation was needed, which suggests the pattern was familiar enough to feel ordinary. First sleep, a stretch of deep rest, then waking, then later, second sleep. Not for everyone in exactly the same way, and not in every place on Earth. Human sleep has always varied, but there is enough historical evidence to suggest that segmented sleep was not some bizarre exception. For many people, it was part of ordinary life, and the middle part of the night was not always treated like a problem. That may be the biggest difference between their world and ours. Today, if you wake up and cannot immediately fall back asleep, it can feel like failure. Your mind starts to race. You look at the clock. You think about tomorrow. You think about how tired you will be. You think about the fact that you are still awake. But in a different world, waking in the dark may not have carried that same panic, because the dark itself meant something different. Night was quieter, longer, less controlled, more physical. A fire might need tending. Wind might move through cracks in the wall. Someone in the same room might stir, cough, or shift under a blanket. The house did not disappear when people went to sleep. It kept breathing around them, and so did they. That is the part modern people often miss. Sleep was not happening inside a sealed, controlled space. It was happening inside ordinary life. During that waking period, people sometimes prayed. Sometimes they reflected on dreams. Sometimes they spoke softly with someone beside them. Sometimes they added wood to the fire, checked the room, or simply sat awake for a while before returning to bed. Some older references even suggest that couples sometimes used that quiet middle stretch of the night for intimacy, partly because they were rested after the first sleep. That detail matters, not because it is dramatic, but because it makes the pattern feel human. This was not just broken sleep. It was sleep shaped by a different world. That world was colder, darker, rougher, less private. People often slept in shared spaces. Families, children, servants, and older relatives might all be close together. Bedding was simpler. Rooms were less insulated. Outside, there was weather, noise, and danger. Inside, there was less comfort and less separation between rest and the rest of life. Sleep was not a sealed experience. It was part of household life. And if household life carried on through the night, then waking in the middle of it may not have felt unnatural at all. So what changed? Artificial light changed it. Industrial life changed it. Clocks changed it. Factory schedules, school schedules, stricter work hours, and later, screens all changed it. As evenings became brighter, people stayed up later. As mornings became less flexible, sleep had to fit into a tighter frame, and once that happened, the old rhythm had less room to survive. Over time, waking in the middle of the night stopped feeling normal and started feeling like an interruption. That shift matters, because sometimes what we call natural is partly historical. Not everything about sleep is just biology. Some of it comes from expectation. Some of it comes from routine. Some of it comes from the kind of world you live in. Now, this is not medical advice. Modern sleep problems are real, and they can come from stress, health, environment, and habit. But history does suggest something worth remembering. Waking up in the middle of the night may not be as unnatural as modern life makes it feel. And maybe that is why this old pattern still feels so interesting now. Because it reminds us that night used to have structure. It used to have silence. It used to have waiting. It used to have stillness, darkness, and time enough for people to drift out of sleep, sit inside the quiet for a while, and then return to rest. People once slept in two parts, not because they were broken, but because their world was built differently. And once that world changed, sleep changed with it. So the next time you wake in the middle of the night and feel like something has gone wrong, it may be worth remembering this. For a long time, being awake in the dark was not a mistake. It was just part of being human.